For the purposes of the recording, hello everybody and welcome to Structures of Allegiance and Morality with Samuel Cumming and Rory Kelly, also Gabriel Greenberg in absence. Take it away, Rory and Sam.
Sam?
Should I give people a recap of the presentation? Is that the idea?
Well, there's no hands being raised so far, so you guys feel free to.
Did you want us to go, Aaron? Did you want us to go literally straight into discussion?
We can certainly do that, unless Rory and Sam have anything that they'd like to add that wasn't captured, but they can have the first word.
Yeah, I didn't have anything I wanted to say in particular start off with, and maybe if misunderstandings about our paper develop or become clear in the questions, then we'll try to clarify. How about we go like that?
Yeah.
Aaron, I'm not seeing the raise hand function.
Yes,
I see it. No, yep. I see it.
Oh, yeah. If you go into participants,
I hereby raise my hand.
Go right ahead, Marie.
You sure? Okay. All right. Okay. So Rory, Sam, thank you for your paper. Special thanks is one of the targets of the paper, which is always it's normally a pleasure, and it is a pleasure on this occasion. So I don't want to pose a question which is just going to kind of become obsessively focused on some detail of my account. So let me just say a general thing and then a much more specific question about the sort of new model and the case study which inspires it, which basically I'm persuaded by. I think it unearths something really interesting and important. The general thing to say is that, and I dare say Noel would say something similar, but it's certainly true that, I think the criticisms you offer of the incarnation of my model I agree with almost all of it as regards the 1995 articulation of it. But it's been through a few articulations since then, some of which touch on some of the issues and the worries that you're raising. So, for example, there's a string of papers about anti-hero narrative structures, which try and address a version of the problem you're addressing, which is to say that finding that we are allied to a character can't always be simply reduced to questions of moral approval, especially in a narrow sense of moral. Okay, so that ends my just a general kind of comment. The question would be this. So I think that the idea of a kind of a surrogate figure who is the moral center of a narrative, and that figure is often, in the version you give, it's a secondary figure who kind of plays that important role as a kind of moral paragon or sounding board for the central character. I think you've identified a very crucial structure with the kind of theoretical implications you say it has. I'm curious though about your thoughts on narratives which achieve the same thing in a broad sense, but without embodying the moral center in a character. So in other words, where you have that same sense that you're rooting for the protagonist. The protagonist is a complex amalgam of good and bad. They have potential to become better, morally speaking, but there is no embodiment in a secondary character of a kind of, a moral paragon or a morally guiding kind of figure, which is, I think, the kind of figure you have in mind. Does the question make any sense? In other words, remove the, oh, am I blocking the microphone? Did you hear any of that?
Yes.
Yes.
You did?
Yes.
Okay.
It makes sense.
So I forget the name of the character in the Billy Wilder film you talk about, right? But if you imagine the same film, but you remove the doctor character, right? And you still want that critical moral perspective on the main character, and I'm sure that there are films which exist like that, where, as it were, the moral perspective is just created, so to speak, by the overarching narration of the film, right? Well, that may be a trickier thing to achieve. Anyway, I've said more than enough.
Yeah, sometimes what I've noticed is sometimes they actually take the role and they combine it with another one. There's a number of romantic stories where the object of romantic interest plays both roles, like in Chicken Run and in Lego Batman movie. I'm trying to think of some other ones. I'm on the spot and I can't think of them. So I think in some cases, there may not be a specific moral center who just plays that role the way Victor Laszlo does and the way Dr. Dreyfus does in The Apartment. But I do think there's ways that they will combine it with another character. Maybe it's a type of economy. I don't know. But I suspect in the case of The Apartment, if they got rid of that character, they'd have to restructure Fran's character. And she couldn't be a kind of mirror of Baxter, because she's the co-protagonist in the film, and she's also a morally mixed co-protagonist. And I don't know that they could have that if they didn't have Dr. Dreyfus. These are really complex structural issues. So that's the first thing that pops in my head. Sam?
Yeah, so is everyone hearing me okay? Because my internet isn't great. It seems in principle that this should be possible, but when I talked to Rory recently about this, he couldn't find an example of a character arc story which didn't have a moral center. So for what that's worth. But it seems like sometimes genre should be, obvious signals of genre should be able to signal a particular kind of morality, whether it's the morality of the criminal underworld or something like that, without specifically having a character that is a mouthpiece for that morality. It seems in principle like it should be possible, but that it just might be the preferred way of doing it in a character arc story. So yeah, that's my only thoughts about it.
The next question is.
I see there's a whole list of hands, so I'll resist the temptation to come back for more.
Thank you for that exercise in willpower, Murray. I know it's hard for you.
Rare exercise of willpower.
Next up is Paolo Russo. Paolo, are you there?
The mysterious Paolo Russo. Maybe move on to Rika.
He's there and he's not muted, but we can't hear him.
Paolo, Paolo, we can't hear you. You've got some sound issues happening. If you don't mind, if you want to get those sorted out, we'll come back to you. Sorry, but we best move on. Next up is Dr. Schubert.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful presentation. My comment has something to do with style, and I'm thinking like style in two senses. Style as in Les Samurai with Alain Delon is like filled with style. It's a very stylish film, and he has really great style, so he's like really well dressed. And of course, I think at the time he was like the most popular male actor in France. So I think we always think of style as a good thing. So we tend to align us with those who have a lot of style. And the other thing I thought about was it's actually also a kind of style like being cool. So we often think that if someone is cool, like you're cool when you are morally superior in the sense that you take your own stance, you stand your own ground. So if you're not cool if you do the same that everyone else does. You're like cool if you dress in your own way and you act like you sort of have your own morality. So I'm thinking like other films where I think that people are cool. Silence of the Lambs, where Anthony Hopkins, he's like, he normally plays the good guy, and we know him as a good guy. So even though he eats people, then we still think of him as Anthony Hopkins. And then he sort of tends to eat the people who, when I'm being political incorrect, at the time we thought of as the people we could spare. I think that they were gay. And I think he has a comment where he ate his liver with a bottle of Chianti, which is sort of quite cool. So that's it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's sort of that's definitely Tarantino's approach, right? Is that cool has its own value, and I think he's right. I think he's right, and I agree with everything that you're saying. I think another thing about the film too, that, you know, and it's something screenwriters do all the time that I don't necessarily hear talked about when dealing with issues of allegiance. He is very cool and he's very good looking, but he's also quite alone, right? And he's this loner figure. And I think, you know, a lot of times filmmakers, one of the primary ways they try to gain allegiance or sympathy for characters is to, you know, make us feel bad for them. You know, Rick suffers a lot in Casablanca, and I think that his loneliness, I think Jeff's loneliness plays a big role in us, you know, feeling something for him. And I think that this, you know, in another paper I'm working on now, I pointed out, you know, one of the, you know, like in Stella Dallas, right? How does Stella compete with Steven? Because he's so polite and morally upright and perfect in so many ways. And one of the ways that she competes with them is they humiliate her a number of times in the narrative. And I think the idea is to just make you sympathize with her, with her pain. And I think something like that as well is going on with the character of Jeff Costello. Sam?
I don't have anything to add. Maybe just one of us can answer each question.
Okay.
Is Paolo?
Okay, let's check back in with Paolo. Hopefully you're.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, definitely. Go ahead.
Good. I'm sorry for earlier, but every time I log into Zoom, it seems to acquire a volition of itself and select a different microphone, and I don't know why. Anyway, thank you very much. I was really interested in the presentation because I've been studying these issues for quite a long time now, although I mostly use them and apply to the analysis of TV seriality for TV dramas. Actually, I'm piggybacking probably a little bit on Mary mentioning the popularity of the anti-hero characters in contemporary TV dramas. I'm not sure I buy into the articulation of the issue on the moral account, because actually, if you do lack a moral center, and I was analyzing, for instance, I will give you the instance of especially the first season of an Italian TV drama series, Gomorrah, which some of you might have heard of, and it lacks any, there is no presence of any moral center. So if there is no moral center, do you think that you could actually apply your analysis to such a narrative? And if not, actually, my 2 cents would be that actually what is at play is probably more like a sunk cost effect. And because you invest so much in the story and in the characters, and then at some point, even if you don't like the characters, you basically you continue to throw good money at bad after bad, you know, or kind of. I know it's an oversimplification, and so I wanted to know what you think about that.
I just make a brief clarification, and then Rory can say more specific things. The idea of the moral center is not that it's supposed to be present in every story, or even that it's inevitably present in the specific kind of story where a character experiences moral growth, but that in such a story, the latter sort of story where a character starts off with mixed moral impulses and ends up usually on the good side by the end, generally speaking, we have found that there is a moral center in those stories. Now, people in the comments are reeling off tons and tons of counterexamples, so we're not necessarily trying to adhere to that or sustain that claim. It's just something we noticed. The point of the piece that we wrote was that just one such example, where you have a moral center who is nonetheless not the sympathetic center or the protagonist, is a counterexample to, as Murray was saying earlier, the early version of his view, which has gone through subsequent iterations. So that was the point of the present. I just wanted to, I'm not saying you were confused or anything, I just wanted to make that clarifying point.
Yeah, sure. I was not implying that you did. Actually, I was basically more hypothesizing, or let's assume that there is no moral center. Would you apply the same kind of argument? You know, that was more my question. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sam.
Well, I was just going to say the specific argument that we gave relied on there being a moral center in the particular stories we were talking about. Now, I'm not saying there isn't a different kind of argument against the the moral account based on different, non-character arc stories. We've seen in the past literature a lot of such arguments, and we're not commenting on those, but we were making a different argument. Yeah.
Thank you, Paolo. Next up, I believe, is Dr. Plantinga.
Carl, you can call me Carl. Anyway,
No.
yeah, Rory and Sam, your argument of, I agree with your argument completely, but I think it's sort of a subspecies of a larger argument that I would make, and that is that the idea that morality determines allegiance in our viewing is too rational. It's too rationalistic, and it strikes me that viewers aren't that rational. And I guess one thing I would say is that I think that viewers are easily led to mistake characteristics of various characters in a film or a television show as moral when they're actually not at all, or to confuse moral and non-moral characteristics in developing allegiances. So I think that's even an even broader way of talking about what you guys are talking about in a more specific sense. Margaret Brun-Vag deals with that really well in her book, The Antihero in American Television. So she refers to a lot of the social science literature on this issue. So Dolph Zillman, years ago, he comes up with what's called moral disposition theory, the idea that we like to root for characters who we think are morally good, and we feel good when good things happen to them, and we feel bad when bad things happen to them, and vice versa with the morally bad characters. And then a lot of other social scientists come in later, Arthur Rainey, for example, who Margaret Brun-Vag draws from quite extensively. And he says, no, it's not that simple. Let's look at all the ways in which we do not respond to characters in terms of allegiance simply on the basis of our moral judgment, or a judgment that we can say appeals to clearly moral criteria. We don't do that. So, you know, I think that we sometimes form allegiances on the basis of coolness, which is what Rika talked about, but it can be whether someone's good looking or not, whether they're witty, whether we perceive them to be socially somehow attractive, apart from cool. Just all kinds of things that I think people are prone to, that contribute to a sense of allegiance. So I think morality can be one of the major factors that certainly is one of the major factors that screenwriters use to try to develop allegiances. But there's so much more going on. I'm sorry, that's not really a question, but I wonder if you have a response to that.
Yeah, I do. Thea, sorry, my son just walked in. Thanks. Okay. It seems to me, look, I think we probably would agree with some of the stuff we haven't read yet. And Dan Flory sent us a nice reading list earlier today, so we can get caught up. But it seems to me some of the arguments that have been put forward under this banner are things that I could respond to on behalf of Murray, either now or in his earlier incarnation, which is to say that if what I mean by moral is wide enough to include, or you know, things that influence moral judgment, if I make that a wide enough net to include things like music and iconography, and you know, I say all of those things influence our moral judgment. And even I think you seem sympathetic to the idea that, you know, it may not be reasonable or rational or correct moral judgment, but in the end, it is a moral judgment that we're making. We're trying to argue even against that by saying that if there really are characters whom we judge as morally superior, and it's important to making sense of the story that we judge them as morally superior, and yet we don't side with them as we don't side with Victor Laszlo over Rick, right? Then there's a problem. You know, we need to be able to distinguish within our interpretation of the story, even relative to the moral values projected by the story, always rational. They might be automatic or influenced by all kinds of factors that on reflection shouldn't be influencing them. Still, this distinction needs to be made in the character arc structure.
Go to the next question. Thank you.
We had Niall Amruchu, your hand was up earlier. I see it's down now. Did you have a question, Niall? Okay, it's down. So then next up in the queue would be Dan Flory.
Thanks. I guess, you know, what I want to raise is an element that I think is relevant, especially now, which is that some allegiances that we can have can be racial, okay? And I mentioned this in the email that Sam mentioned, but I mean, one of the things that hasn't been well explored is the idea that a lot of our allegiances can be, you know, well, they're going to be in some sense moral, but in another sense, there's no reason for them to be moral. But, you know, there's this presumption in lots of mainstream cinema that, you know, whites represent a kind of human universal. And so they have a kind of advantage as characters to appeal to people much more broadly, especially whites, but that lots of other viewers have learned as well. But that presents a challenge to present characters who are non-white, in the sense that that's an obstacle to be overcome in making a character appealing. And, you know, I've written a little bit about this, but I mean, there's mountains of more ideas and kind of exploration that needs to be done here. And I just wondered if either Rory or Sam or Gabe had some kind of reflection on this.
Sam?
Hello?
I'm here. It's something I need to process and think about. It seems right, you know, the sort of thoughts I'm having are similar to the things that I was just saying to Carl. But I'd need to think further about it. But thanks very much both for your question and your email.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah, I think it's something that would require more thought before I responded to it. And it was actually something I was thinking about yesterday. So when I saw your email, for obvious reasons, I was beginning to think, like, you know, what qualifies as a moral center in our culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, what types of people are going to be privileged in that way in films. And so I had actually started thinking about that yesterday, and I didn't get very far. I was talking to some of my graduate students about it, and it is something I'm going to look at what you have written and think about it some more. But I think it's a very relevant point. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, technically we're at the end of the session. As we intimated, we can go on a little bit longer if you wish. So for those of you who want to stick around, we can continue the conversation. I think I'd just like to remind you on behalf of Elena, who's here, that there are the coffee breakout rooms in Discord. If you are predisposed to continuing on the conversations, that's a mechanism that you can do so. Otherwise, feel free to stick around. The hosts maybe can, the presenters can determine how long they want to subject themselves to grilling, but when they want to cut it off, they can wave their hands furiously or do this kind of symbol. Otherwise, next up in the queue is Josh Baldwin. You had your hand up earlier. Josh, you're more than welcome to ask your question now if you like.
Hey, yeah, I found your presentation's arguments pretty interesting. Yeah, I'm actually from the Zillman family and worked both under Art Rainey and others. And I'm currently doing work on making different moral values salient and that are liking towards characters who do bad things. We can like them as long as they're upholding one morality that we make salient in the narrative. And if they violate other things, other type of morality that are not salient, we can still like them. And I'm wondering how close that type of empirical work is close to your argument.
Roy, you're on your own.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was just thinking for a second. No, it comes back, I guess, a little bit to Silence of the Lambs, right? I didn't remember that there was a sexual that there was some sort of sexual preference to the people that he ate, but at the end of the movie, when he wants to eat the man who runs the psychiatric prison where he lives, you know, that's sort of him taking care of the more villainous character in the story. And so I think that seems to be what you're getting at, is that we can create these kind of we can relativize morality and make it work that way. And you know, another similar character that we don't talk about in this paper, but one that I've talked about in a presentation I gave here a couple of years ago, I can't remember, is there's also in the character arc story, there's a character that's worse than the protagonist. So he sort of sits in between these two characters. I call the second one the moral corrupter, right? So in Casablanca, that would be Captain Renault, who's always sort of bullying Rick and trying to cajole Rick into either not getting involved in the Nazis' campaign against Victor, or if not actually supporting it, right? And so in comparison to Renault, Rick looks better, right? He's torn in the middle, even though he won't do anything. He's, I think Dana Pullman in action. This is not quite what you said, but I think what they do is they try to make different levels of moral behavior stand in contrast to each other, so that again it affects how we view the central character. So for me, I mean, I do think morality does play a huge role, and that defining that morality, what is really bad and what is really good, becomes important to our understanding our relationship to the main character, if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think one of the key differences is that, if I understand that correctly, you think that the narrative creates some sort of new moral schema that limits how people are making moral judgments that are different than what we do in real life.
Probably film by film.
Right, and I guess I would argue that people do moral judgment exactly the same in movies as they would in real life. It's just what framework they're put in that may most salient in their mind at the present time. So I might disobey an order from a policeman because maybe respecting our leaders is not important in the narrative, even though if I read the news, that might be really horrible if someone did that.
Right. Yeah. For sure. I mean, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think movies do that all the time. There's always some higher, not all movies, but there's always some higher morality that the transgressor is following, in many films. Yes.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks, Rory. We have time hopefully for more questions. Next up is Casper.
Okay, very briefly, Rory, thank you for an interesting paper. You were just saying that you were talking about Chicken Run, and Chicken Run doesn't strike me as a character arc narrative at all. And I mean, Ginger is the protagonist, and she's definitely also the moral center of the story. So in a sense, that doesn't really seem to be a terribly relevant example here.
Huh. I was thinking of Rocky, right?
But Rocky is just an accessory, right? I mean, he's certainly not the protagonist. Ginger is, right?
No, you're right. You're right. I'm sort of in my mind, I had recreated it as his the typical male coming of age story. As my friend always says, oh, good, another male coming of age story, just what we need. But I had actually sort of, I think you're right, recreated that in my mind as more his story than it is hers. So I stand corrected. Damn it. Well done, Casper. But okay, but similarly though, have you seen the Lego Batman movie? Because that is he is the morally flawed protagonist, and Barbara Gordon plays the dual role of the love interest and the moral center, a part she shares with Alfred. And so I think I only bring it up because I think I had somehow conflated those plots when they're actually quite different. Yes.
No problem.
Okay, next we have a question from Jason Gendler.
Oh no, I lowered my hand a long time ago. I was just going to raise an example, but it's in the chat if you want to go back and look at that, of a moral, a show, it's a TV show without a moral center, but embodying a character, but I think it does have a moral center. It's Rami, which is a Hulu series about a guy, deeply flawed guy who wants to be better. So maybe a non-embodied moral center would be the idea of an ideal Muslim in that show.
What's the show, Jason? I'm sorry. I was looking through the chat and not listening to you.
It's Ramy, R-A-M-Y. It's about a young man in New York who's Muslim, and how he tries to negotiate being a Muslim with being a modern male in the world, and the conflict that he has with that. And he's a terrible person. He's incredibly selfish. But there isn't really any other character who's like an ideal person, at least in season 1. In season 2, they introduce a Mahershala Ali character who plays a sheikh, who Ramy aspires to be more like. So it was just a suggestion rather than a question, really.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Next in the queue is Julian Lapointe.
Hi, so yeah, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I've also really enjoyed the work of some of the authors whom you were dialoguing with, so it was a real pleasure to read. This kind of overlaps with some points that have been raised so far, but I was wondering if you could think of, like, say, an implicit or moral center. So it's not one that's given explicitly anywhere in the text. There's nothing pointed out in terms of a character or a line or an action that would be kind of forthrightly moral, and the film kind of is premised on the viewer bringing to bear their own moral intelligence onto the film. And how would that be worked out interpretively? And kind of a side issue, but if I read correctly, Wayne C. Booth and others have put forth this idea that we tend to model our responses to characters on how we react to people in real life. And I just can't help but wonder, you know, watching La Samurai, you can admire the serial killer from the safe distance of it being a fictional narrative. Nothing at all is how we'd respond to a serial killer in real life. So I wonder if we should be thinking about this extensionally, or in terms of as referring to the real world or real world applications. Is it not like intentional with an S, like it's not kind of a self-enclosed imaginary space? And that might be why morality can get bracketed so easily or so readily, because it's more of a thought experiment. It's not something that has some kind of immediate practical applications in our daily lives.
I'm handing that off to you, Sam.
Does that make sense, or?
It did. I don't have anything good to say in response. Only that the second part of your question, when you're talking about Booth, I had the same thought, which strikes me that Booth isn't right either if he's taken in that paragraph as narrowly claiming that it's the sole grounds for allegiance are the ways we respond to people in ordinary life, because including things that are non-moral. For the reason that you just gave, and I had the exact same thought. Even if someone's cool, when we find out they're a serial killer, for most of us, we're probably turned off them. So there must be more to it. And of course, Booth has a story about what else there is to it, which has to do with the role alignment plays in allegiance, which it doesn't necessarily get spelled out in a lot of detail, but it does get kind of appealed to. Of course, he doesn't make those distinctions as clearly as Murray Smith does. But as to the more complex hypotheses that you were suggesting, I think they're great, but I don't have anything remotely as clever to.
Thanks, Sam. If we have time for one more question, there's one from Todd, and that will have taken us through all of the original questioners, and then it's up to the two presenters if they want to carry on things further. But if we take one from Todd, we'll have given everybody who was originally raising their hand the opportunity to query the two presenters.
Thank you. So first of all, I have to apologize. I was not able to attend most of this session, although I did watch your really interesting presentation. So I wanted to, so forgive me if this covers ground that you guys already covered. But it seems to me that you guys, like Murray and like Noel, are still working within a moral frame. It's just a kind of an adjusted moral frame. In other words, you're saying, if I understand you right, it's not as simple of the best moral person's on top, then the next, then the next, then the next. Rather, there's other kind of considerations, but you're posing, as opposed to what Carl has written about and mentioned here, you're posing that there still is a moral factor. And that is our investment in the moral redemption of the character, if I understand you right. And so there are characters, and the ones that I'm thinking of now are the lead, the Richard Widmark character in Night in the City, the Al Pacino character in Godfather 2, where here are characters, they're sort of they're despicable. And both of those movies have moral centers, which I like your idea of this character that kind of embodies goodness, that does not elicit, I think, much sympathy. And our main hopes are with this character for his, in both these cases, for his redemption, neither of which really give it to us, at least in those movies. But that is where our investment comes from, in the kind of moral progress that we are hoping for, which is another factor. So instead of having a hierarchical model where good is on top, worst is on the bottom, you're kind of factoring in, well, what do we hope for with regard to the morality of these characters? Do I understand you right? Is that a fair way to characterize where you're going?
Yeah. Yeah, that was a pretty good assessment from my point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I think we would be open to moral factors influencing allegiance in the ordinary way that Carroll and Smith think they do too. But on top of that, there might be something like what you just said, and Rory has said as much as well. I'm not sure if it made it into the paper, but that's certainly something we have in mind.
Oh yeah. I have yeah, because we are specifically trying to deal with character arc stories about, I mean, there's more than one kind of character arc story, right? There's the story of Michael Corleone going its ethical development in reverse, right? What's that Bogart film from 1937 where he becomes he loses his job and he becomes does he join the Klan? But anyway, there's lots of examples of
Black Legion.
Black Legion, yeah. There's lots of examples of Scholes and Kellogg in The Nature of Narrative, they talk about the development of a very specific form of character development, which is ethically schematized, if I'm pronouncing schematized right. Which they link to the Christian narrative of conversion, and they don't see it really coming into Western literature until after that narrative. And so, presumably it's the most common character arc is the ethical development of a character, right? And so that's specifically what we're focusing on, is if it is about the moral improvement of the protagonist, what are some of the ways that can be handled? And, I think a number of people have been able to point out that it doesn't always require a moral center, but, there are a lot of films, it seems, On the Waterfront, it has the Carl Malden character, and About a Boy has the little Marcus 10-year-old character who puts Will on the right track. In Wild, with Reese Witherspoon, her mother is her life coach. She's the moral center. It's clearly something screenwriters consider a very useful, good trick for helping them map out for the audience where the character is supposed to end up, right? And because I don't think it's even necessarily necessary for the moral center to even try to be influencing the main character. They can just operate emblematically. I think that's how Stephen operates in Stella Dallas, right? He makes a few weak attempts to chastise her, but for the most part, she lives her life, and then in the end, makes a moral choice, which is a ridiculous one, but it's a moral choice. So I think that's what we're focusing on, is that there's this good trick that screenwriters have figured out and probably learned from people before them.
Thanks, Rory. Marie is next in the queue. However, Marie, I wonder if you would consider ceding your position to a new questioner first, who's Hedley Browning. Would you mind allowing Hedley to ask the question who hasn't had the opportunity?
Sure. I would be keen on getting my question after Hedley. That's okay.
I'll be very quick. I think you know what I'm going to ask, which is. So we had a mention of kind of raising the idea of race with regards to moral allegiance. And I was wondering about gender with regards to both what's represented on screen and also in terms of spectatorship, and whether that has an impact on the interplay with moral allegiance and kind of our moral judgments.
I would, I'm echoing. I would imagine so. These are really interesting questions that I want to explore more. And well, I don't know. I want to be careful what I say, but I'm trying to think of maybe older classical films where there might be a preference for male moral centers for some fear of the character appearing chastising otherwise, which would be a very gendered view of how it would work and be a sort of nefarious one. So I don't know, but that's an interesting question that I'm going to look at moving forward.
Sam, do you want to chime in?
No, I feel like there are many other people who would be better at answering this question than me.
Thanks, Sam. In that case, the eagerly awaiting Murray Smith.
Yeah. Think of the act of willpower, Aaron. You know, the whole hour I've been waiting to say another thing.
Murray, I'm sorry, I gotta go.
You gotta go?
I'll see you, Murray. I gotta go. Sam's gotta go too.
It's been great. It's been great seeing you guys.
Come over to my place for beers.
All right. So again, many more things to say than there is time to say, but just two quick things. One is to say that one way of recognizing what various people have been commenting on. I mean, I guess I was the one who kind of said the first thing on this line of thought, which is to say, what about the moral center when there's no obvious character embodiment of the moral center? I mean, the way this might be talked about by, I'll be here for a few minutes. Yeah, a few minutes. Sorry. Noise is off. The way structural narratologists would handle this kind of issue is, they talk about it as a function. A function which can be realized in different ways by particular narratives or particular types of narratives. So, for example, another possibility that I don't think we've touched on would be a narrative in which the moral center function is distributed across a whole set of characters. So you might not have one character who consistently plays that kind of moral sidekick paragon. Come on, you can do better. Steadily throughout the whole story, but you might have a whole succession of them playing that kind of, certainly a group of them rather than one. So that's one particular thought. The other thing I wanted to say is it sort of comes back to this question of the relative weight of moral considerations versus non-moral considerations in the allegiances we form with characters. And there's a kind of dialectic, right, that's gone back and forth over the years, and I hate to say it now, over the decades that some of us have been, working on these issues. So if you think of, the starting point being the arguments from Noel, and it has to be said it was Noel, first of all, Noel and then me, which essentially say we need to take stock of moral considerations, right? And remember the backdrop for the two of us saying that was a theoretical landscape in which nobody was allowed to talk about something as old-fashioned, right, as morality, and responding to characters. So stage one in the dialectic is, let's be honest, let's get real. Moral judgment plays a kind of big role in the sympathies and attachments and allegiances we form with characters. Stage two in the dialectic, somebody like Carl comes along and says, but hang on, what about all these other ways in which we find real people and fictional characters appealing, which are nothing to do with morality? So stylishness, wit, other kinds of non-moral excellence and accomplishment, right? That can make people appealing.
Race, gender.
Well, they cross-cut in a different way, I think. But I'm not trying to deny that, right? So lots of other factors. Now, stage three in the dialectic, at least as far as I'm concerned, is okay. But then, what are we saying? Are we saying that all of these factors are on a par, right, with one another? And I say no. I say, so the metaphor that I would use for this is that moral judgments, and they may not be carefully wrought moral judgments. I've always had in mind quick and dirty moral responses, right? That's just wrong. That's outrageous. That kind of reaction, right? I think those reactions still occupy a kind of center of gravity in our responses to characters. And I think that will be true in the character arc case. Because if you imagine a narrative in which you've got a less than perfect character, right, who is the protagonist, but they are so much less than perfect, they are utterly irredeemable, I think you've got a difficulty in the character arc struggle, right? So what I'm saying is, I agree with the force of the character arc example to the extent that it shows the moral, our moral judgment doesn't neatly align with our sympathies, and that shows what you claimed it does. But I don't think you can create a protagonist figure who will have that, who will play the role they need to play in the character arc structure, unless they have substantial moral potential, right? If they lack moral potential, lack the potential to be better, I mean, it's not enough that they could become more charming, more witty, better tennis players. Those things won't work, right? So this is where I think Carl and I may differ. And in some ways, I think your argument gives me some ammunition. That I want to come back and say, yes, I recognize the non-moral factors, but I don't think there's complete symmetry between them. I think that moral judgments, quick and dirty moral judgments, occupy a central and important role. So that's mine.
Yeah. By the way, everybody, I just sent a link to the full paper for anybody who wants to download it from Dropbox. Murray, I agree. We only covered so much as we could cover.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Thing. And
yeah.
One of the moral center serves a lot of purposes, and one of them is the fact that they believe in the flawed protagonist. They're in their life and they believe in them. Like over and over again, Victor trusts that Rick is going to make the honorable choice. Everybody else, right? Everybody else is falling apart, but Victor waits it out and believes in Rick. And I think that, another thing we can say is that it's like we're not just dealing with the moral assessments that viewers make of the characters, we're dealing with the moral assessments that characters make of each other, right? And I think that like one of the examples that we used in the paper is when Rick judges that German banker, who they simply call him the Deutsche Bank. But in judging that character and not letting him into his casino, if that elevates Rick morally in any way as it diminishes that other guy, then an entire network of moral judgments within the story are possible. And I think that one role that Victor plays is to simply believe in Rick and, further prime us for his moral development, right? So, and if he were irredeemable, I don't think it would work. I mean, in the presentation I gave a couple of years ago, I talked about how when you have these flaws in behavior patterns, the other one is negative pattern, and the positive one. Without the positive pattern, there'd be no way to set up what happens at the end, right? Even Laos Egri says this, that if a character has to contain the seeds of their change, right? And so Rick contains those seeds. He fought in the Spanish Civil War. He fought in Ethiopia. He's nice to his employees. So I agree with you. Like, you can't throw all of that stuff out. Otherwise, you're giving up all the rules of setup and payoff, right? I'm kind of rambling at this point, but what I'm saying is that I do agree with you that we do need these down and dirty moral judgments, and the movie counts on that by giving you these flashes of Rick's goodness throughout the length of the film. There's an article by Alberto Garcia about Walter White and Tony Soprano, and his idea is that you can cyclically reclaim allegiance for characters over the course of a show. And I think that's what they do even in feature films, is every so often Rick does something to reaffirm his potential. But I rambled, I'm sorry.
Well, in deference to our presenters, it seems that Sam has pulled a goose to Rory's Maverick and has ejected from the seat. Hopefully he's achieved escape velocity rather than cracking his head on the cockpit, as in that ill-fated ejection attempt. I think that gives us a prompt to formally conclude these proceedings. I want to thank our one presenter now, and also Sam, and also our co-author for their time, for everybody for joining in. Maybe on Carl's and the organizers' behalf, I will invite people to join us again bright and early for our first presentation, which is at 10:30 a.m., where we will get to hear from Rika Schubert on Wrinkles in Face. So that is at 10:30 tomorrow, if the current schedule is correct. Also a reminder that there will be a live conversation with Paul Schrader at 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon as well too. So hopefully people will join in. Also, don't forget about Discord, and you can carry on your conversations in the coffee breakout room. I will stop recording at this time, and certainly the recording and the chat will be uploaded to wherever that is being hosted in a short time. I will keep the room open for a while if folks want to stick around. Otherwise, I will look forward to seeing people during the proceedings tomorrow. Thank you everyone for your time, attention, and questions, and thank you very much.
Thanks everyone. Thanks everybody. Thanks Aaron. Thanks Murray. Thanks Carl. Thanks everybody. Thanks Dan. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Rory. Cheers. Thanks.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.